Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing viewership and support. For our members, we are scheduling a number of member-exclusive events beginning in July. Please stay tuned to the end of the program and I'll update all of the upcoming programs. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dan Schnur, who leads our Politics in the Time of Coronavirus weekly programs, in addition to many other moderated programs.
Hello, Kim. How are you?
Happy post 4th of July. We're glad to be back on track with you.
Happy post 4th of July to you. I hope you had a good holiday weekend.
We all did. I think we all chilled. But we've got 3 hot topics, though, coming up. So let me run through those and then turn it over to you. Topic number 1, 6 months after the January 6th riots, what comes next? Second, how immigration reform will shape the midterm elections. And third, what is critical race theory and why does it matter? Turning it over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. And thanks to all of you for joining us this week. As always, we're really grateful to have you as part of our programming. And on behalf of everyone at the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, hope you had a very happy and relaxing holiday weekend. But we're going to start out right away by talking about the January investigation into the events of January 6th, the Capitol riots that took place that day. And it occurred to us that given that we celebrated our nation's independence over this past weekend, and given that today we're actually marking the 6-month anniversary of those January 6th riots, it seemed to us that it made a particularly good time. This would make it a particularly good time for us to talk about the establishment of a select congressional committee to examine the January 6th violence. Now, Nancy Pelosi's decision to set up a special committee is important for 2 reasons. First, of course, the investigation would be the best opportunity to learn about the causes of the violence that took place that day and how to protect against similar insurrections in the future. Any number of congressional committees have looked into very specific aspects of the events of that day, but none have examined the violence in a more comprehensive manner. And that's what Pelosi and her allies believe can happen with the appointment of this special committee. Now, as you may remember, originally Pelosi had proposed a bipartisan commission, like the one that existed, that was appointed after the terrorist attacks of September 11th back in 2001. And Republicans successfully fought against the establishment of a bipartisan commission. And the speculation is that many in the GOP felt that scrutiny of Donald Trump's conduct prior to the events of that day would harm their party in next year's midterm elections. So now, instead of a board made up of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, with a deadline to finish their work by the end of this year, before the midterm elections got underway, now Republicans are facing a committee with a Democratic majority, and they seem very, very likely to continue their work into the election year next year. Now, the first important question for the committee chair, Congressman Benny Thompson, is whether to call Trump himself as a witness. Now, there's no guarantee that Trump would appear before the committee if asked, even if he was subpoenaed. But it's a more complicated question than it seems, because having Trump testify would raise the profile of the hearings considerably, but it's also a platform that Trump could use to his own advantage with his supporters, particularly heading in to such a high stakes midterm election season. So let's start with that as our first question for today. And Claire, if we can post it, what do you think? Should the Select Committee subpoena Donald Trump when they, as they go through their proceedings? And this one's actually a little bit more simple than most of the questions we posed to you. So just a direct yes or no. Do you think the subcommittee should subpoena the former president, whether or not he adheres to that subpoena, or no, given the platform they might give him, do you think that might not be such a good idea and might detract instead of enhance from their efforts to put together a comprehensive report of the events of that day? So let's see how we did. Oh, this is much closer than I thought it was going to be. Really interesting. Now look at those results. Our group said yes, they do believe that the Select Committee should subpoena Trump, but by a fairly narrow margin of 53 to 47%. So very interesting. Now, moving on, the other reason that this Select Committee is so important is the decision of Republican Representative Liz Cheney to accept Pelosi's invitation to take one of the seats on this committee. Now, the way Pelosi set up the Select Committee, she set it up for 8 members to be appointed by Democrats and 5 members to be appointed by Republicans. But what Pelosi then did is she used one of her one of her seats, to appoint the Republican Liz Cheney, who not only voted in favor of Donald Trump's impeachment, but has been so vocal in her criticism of Trump since then that she was actually removed by the Republican caucus from her leadership position earlier this spring. So the panel ultimately will have 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans, but Cheney's presence on that panel, as Pelosi no doubt calculated, adds a really interesting and a really important wrinkle to how the proceedings will take place. And in addition, it lays the groundwork for what I think could be a seminal battle between the 2 wings of the Republican Party that could establish the party's fundamental identity for years to come. Now, we've talked many times in the past about the 2 factions in the Republican Party, the pro-Trump wing of the party and what I call the pre-Trump wing of the party, the more traditional conservatives who've not been entirely comfortable with Donald Trump during his time in office. Now Cheney is one of many voices. Cheney is one of many voices in that pre-Trump traditional mainstream conservative camp. But her appointment really elevates her to a much greater degree. And because she'll be taking on such a high-profile role in this committee's work over the course of this year and possibly next, it's going to give her a much louder voice and a much greater platform to emerge possibly as the leader of that pre-Trump or anti-Trump faction. Now, there's already speculation that Cheney might seek the presidency in 2024, but whether or not she chooses to run, she's now going to be in a very, very impactful position to define the message and agenda for the party's post-Trump faction, much more than Mitt Romney or Marco Rubio or any others who might be looking to take on that role. Now, for Cheney, in addition to the tremendous opportunity the place on this special committee presents her, it's also accompanied by some potential peril. Now, Trump has been backing challengers to all of the Republican House members who voted for his impeachment earlier this year. And Cheney's defeat in a Republican primary at the hands of one of Trump's loyalists would be very gratifying for him. So what Cheney is going to have to decide once this committee starts examining the events of January 6th is whether to calibrate her comments about Trump, to not stop criticizing him. I don't think that's going to happen, but whether to lower her level of criticism at all in order to lessen the motivation of his supporters against her in her primary campaign in Wyoming next year, or alternatively, whether to continue her very high volume presence and maximize her role as the leader of the anti-Trumpers even if it gives some additional backing and potential for her primary opponents in 2022. So the stakes are really high here, not just for Cheney herself, but for control of the Republican Party. Because if Cheney, particularly taking on this role in which she is likely to criticize Trump very vociferously, if Cheney survives her reelection campaign next year, it's going to give a huge amount of confidence to other Republican candidates in 2022 and 2024 who want their party to move away from Trump. But if Cheney loses, if one of her Trump-backed primary opponents defeats her after she takes on such a high-profile role as his critic, that's going to discourage a lot of those dissidents from risking similar confrontations with Trump and his followers in their own campaigns. So once again, this special committee examining the events of January 6th is of immense importance because we do need to find out what actually happened that day and what caused it. But it also, as I think you can tell, has an immense political impact as well. And this Cheney versus Trump preliminary bout for the 2024 elections is going to set a really important course for how the Republican Party conducts itself, not only in the midterms, but in the presidential election 3 years from now. So question for you before we move on, what do you think will be the impact of the Select Committee's findings on the 2022 elections? Do you think that the Select Committee's examination of the events of January 6th will have a major impact that helps Democrats, or a major impact that motivates Republicans? Do you think it'll have a small impact, but the one that helps Democrats, or a small or relatively minor impact that helps Republicans? Or do you think that this investigation into the events of January 26th is not really going to have much of an impact at all, at least none that benefits or harms one party or the other in these key midterm elections next year? So Claire, let's see what we got from our group for this one. Wow, very interesting. If you do the math on this, we see 16% say a major impact that helps Democrats. But combine that with the third option, a small impact that helps Democrats. What that shows me is that 71%, almost 3/4 of you, believe that the Select Committee's work will help the Democrats next year, whether in a major or minor way. Only 9% of you think that it's going to have an impact that helps Republicans, 3% a major impact and 6% a minor one. And 19%, about a fifth of you, say it's not really going to help or harm one party whatsoever. So let's, Claire, right away, let's go on to our next question. And I'll explain the question a little bit more after all of you answer it. Well, Clara, can we go right away to question number 3? I think we've got these in the wrong order. Do we have the? There we go. All right. So here's a question for you. It's a little bit different than the questions we normally ask, but we thought you might be able to have some fun with it. Question is, what do Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and the South Dakota National Guard all have in common? 3 options here. Number 1, they've all visited Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, of course, on the 4th of July at some point. Option number 2, that all of them, Trump, Harris, and the South Dakota National Guard, have requested funding in this year's federal budget. The third, all have traveled or will travel to the U.S.-Mexico border recently or in the near future. So we've sort of given away the answer here, but let's just take a look at your response to see what we get. All right, most of you cracked our code and figured out what we're doing here. 78%, more than 3/4 of you, correctly said that Trump, Harris, and the South Dakota National Guard have all either traveled to the U.S.-Mexico border recently, or in the case of the National Guard, will be traveling there in the very near future. It's entirely reasonable for the rest of you who guessed one of the other 2 options to think that all 3 might have gone to the to Mount Rushmore at some point, although we don't know if Kamala Harris ever has on the 4th of July. And I'm fairly certain, although not absolutely certain, that Donald Trump does not have a request in this year's budget. But in any case, we asked that question to set up our second topic for discussion today. And what the results should tell you, the fact that both Trump and Harris and the South Dakota National Guard have all gone or are going to the border, should tell you how important both parties believe that immigration and border issues will impact next year's elections. Now, Harris went first. During her trip to Guatemala and Mexico earlier last month, she talked about the root causes of immigration. But while she was there, if you remember, she faced a lot of pressure and a lot of criticism for dismissing questions about whether she would travel to the US-Mexico border as well. Then Trump announced that he was going to the border with Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, and about a dozen Republican members of Congress. So the vice president scheduled her visit a few days before Trump and both parties argued about whether one trip had anything to do with the other. And then at the same time, Kristi Noem, the Republican governor of South Dakota, announced that she was sending National Guard troops from her state to the border to help Texas's efforts. And several other Republican governors decided to send law enforcement from their states to Texas to help secure the border as well. And they did this in response to a request from Governor Abbott, the governor of Texas, who had already sent 1,000 Texas state police officers, as well as Texas National Guard troops to the border last spring, at the time that Texas was seeing a dramatic increase in young migrants coming to the border unaccompanied by parents or other adults. And so back in May, Abbott declared a border crisis disaster in 34 Texas counties to get back costs he said that those counties were facing as a result of the tremendous growth in undocumented immigration coming over the border, which we've talked about quite a bit over the course of the year. Just this week, facing pushback from some of the border counties who didn't want to be part of this disaster declaration, he took them out of the declaration, and the politics have gotten increasingly complicated on both sides, because both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, see this issue as one, as I said a moment ago, having a tremendous impact on next year's midterm elections. Abbott, so you know, has also used that declaration to transfer $250 million in Texas state budget funds to continue construction of the border wall between the US and Mexico after Biden cut off money for additional wall construction that Trump had been pushing for. So again, as I said, it's pretty clear that both parties see that these issues are incredibly important heading into next year's election. But I think it is worth, and Claire, if we can put up that question now, to get your opinion on this. How important do you think immigration issues are going to be next year? And more importantly, says the question specifically asks not just how important will they, but which party will be hurt and which party will be harmed from a raising focus on border and immigration issues. Is it an issue that will have a major impact that helps Democrats or a major impact that helps Republicans? Will it have a small impact on one side or the other? Or ultimately, will neither party benefit from this heightened fight over immigration policy? And let's see what we get for our responses. Also very interesting. 63% of you believe that this is an issue that's going to help Republicans. Almost 2/3 of our group says that immigration is an issue that will help Republicans in next year's election. 30% say a major impact, 33% say a small impact. Only 30% say it's an issue that will help Democrats. 9% say a major impact and 21% say a small one. But it's pretty clear that our group believes that this is an issue that works to the Republicans' benefit And what I will tell you is the Republicans agree with you. There was a Harvard poll that came out just a few days ago that showed voters ranking immigration as the second most important issue in the country, just behind the economy. And that's in line with both parties' internal polling. There was also a Morning Consult poll last month that showed that Democrats might be on even shakier ground on this issue, because what that poll showed is that while Biden overall had very strong approval ratings on the specific issue of immigration, his numbers were much, much lower. And in fact, there were only 2 issues out of all the issues that Morning Consult polled on in which Biden did not have favorable ratings. He is considered very favorably on COVID, his handling of COVID, somewhat favorably on foreign policy, on economic policy, on healthcare, and so on down the line. The only 2 issues on which voters disapproved of the president were crime, which we discussed last week in the context of the New York mayor's race, if you remember, and immigration. And then finally, just in the last couple of days, the Washington Post ABC poll, which is held in particularly high regard, came out, and it showed that only 33% of Americans say they approve of how Biden is handling the issue. 33%, a slight majority say they disapprove, 51%, but that 18% margin is pretty telling. Now that 51% disapproval, let's break that down a little bit further. Not surprisingly, 90% of Republicans disapprove of the way Biden has handled immigration issues. But among Democrats, only 63%, less than 2/3 of registered Democrats, said that they approved of Biden's handling on immigration issues. And that's a fairly tepid level of support, especially when you compare it to the fact that Democrats support Biden by 90% or more on every other issue on which they were polled. And now these poll numbers are largely a reaction to the situation on the ground. The Customs and Border Protection people reported more than 180,000 migrant encounters, as they call them, that their agents had at the border in May. We're still waiting for the numbers in June. But 180,000 migrant encounters at the border in May, that's up from 23,000, more than 8 times the number that arrived in May of 2020. Now, granted, that was during COVID, but to give you some longer term perspective, over the course of the years that the Customs and Border Protection have been monitoring and taking and tabulating these numbers, 180,000 encounters back in May. Their all-time high pre-COVID was 140,000 encounters. So not only was May the largest number of border crossings and border encounters that the Border Patrol has ever counted, but by a fairly large margin over the previous high. Now, not surprisingly, Biden and his advisors recognize the problem. And the Biden administration has been working very hard to reverse the Trump administration's approach to immigration on many fronts. They recently canceled construction contracts for more walls at the border. That's why Governor Abbott has stepped in. And he's worked to rebuild the asylum system. And as we know from talking about Kamala Harris a few weeks ago, has focused a lot on addressing poverty and violence in the Central American countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala as a way to stem migration. But a lot of voters, not just Republicans, but Democrats, feel that Biden has stumbled on the issue as well. And in particular, what concerns voters of both parties was that surge of unaccompanied minors crossing the border earlier this year. And you remember the pictures and the video of the shelters becoming overwhelmed and of administration officials really struggling to process that number of children coming into the country unaccompanied. Now, the situation at the border has improved, but the administration has still not reversed Trump's public health rule that allows the United States to expel migrants, including people seeking asylum, during the pandemic, which is almost certainly what's contributing to Biden's low support among Democrats on that issue. Now, Biden's working on this, like I said. Just last Friday, Biden called for bipartisan action on a pathway to citizenship for some migrants. He said there should be a pathway to citizenship for immigrants who are brought to the United States illegally as children, the so-called dreamers. He said that we should have a pathway to citizenship for foreign-born individuals who have temporary protected status due to some type of strife in their birth countries, and that we should offer a pathway to citizenship for farm workers. But it's worth remembering that his call last Friday was stopped far short of legislation that he endorsed at the beginning of his administration back in January. And that proposal included a much broader option for most immigrants to apply for legal status and then seek citizenship. Now, way back then, and I apologize, in February, Biden and congressional Democrats proposed immigration overhaul that included an 8-year pathway to citizenship for all of the roughly 11 million people living in the United States illegally. Now, Republican lawmakers blocked that effort, and they've criticized the administration for the rise in people who are attempting to cross the border without visas. And they argue that because Biden and the Democrats proposed a pathway to citizenship, that encouraged a lot more people to come. Now, Biden is also preparing to unilaterally, even while the legislative debate goes on, Biden is also preparing to unilaterally enact some fairly major policy changes at the southern border later this summer on his own. And specifically, his administration is planning to withdraw the border control measures that Trump had implemented, that public health emergency order I mentioned a couple minutes ago. This is an emergency order known as Title 42, and it's caused an immense controversy, not only in the US, but in Mexico and in Central America as well, because Title 42 prevents people who illegally enter the United States from seeking asylum, and instead it immediately expels these asylum seekers to Mexico. And in the past, people seeking asylum have been granted preferential treatment because they are here for political rather than economic reasons. The Biden administration says that they plan to stop applying the emergency order to migrant families by the end of the month. And once that order is lifted by the end of July, families that request asylum at the border will be permitted to remain in the United States for the duration of their cases. And that could take years to complete. But being able to stay in the country while their cases are being heard, instead of being sent back across the border, represents probably the most major reversal for Biden of Trump immigration policy. But the problem, or the challenge is that these are executive orders. And of course, Joe Biden's executive orders can be reversed by the next president, just as Biden is reversing Trump's executive orders. Ongoing, more lasting change, that needs to come through legislation. And as we talk about very frequently, Congress is still almost evenly divided. And so some Democrats are talking about passing immigration reform by a majority vote, rather than the 60 votes needed for most legislation. They would include that in the reconciliation budget act that they're considering. And so that might be the fact that Democrats are talking about passing immigration reform by a majority vote. That might be why Biden was talking about the more targeted bill last week that helped dreamers and farm workers rather than the broader expanse of undocumented immigrants. But the Democratic progressive base, many of the party's most liberal voices, are pressuring the White House to stick with the broader proposal because they're concerned that if a pathway to citizenship is established for the dreamers and for farm workers and for those seeking asylum, that the rest of the undocumented community will never get legal status. So this fight is going to continue not just between the parties, but within the Democratic Party with some pretty considerable intensity in the weeks and months ahead. And so the question I'll ask you as we wrap up this section is, what do you think the prospects are for lasting immigration reform? And Clara, if we can put up the next question. We know that Biden is preparing to offer some fairly sweeping and fairly seminal executive orders. But do you think for the more lasting change, do you think the president and Congress are going to be able to pass immigration reform this year? And we have a few options here. Yes, the more sweeping reform, which is what Biden proposed back in February, a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented immigrants. Second, do you think that they'll pass immigration reform but more focused on the groups that we talked about? Third, do you think they'll pass immigration reform but not even anything that big, just something that's more of a fig leaf that doesn't have a lot of substantive impact? Or fourth, no, you don't think Biden or Congress will pass immigration reform this year. So let's see what we get. And look at that. Look at that. Wow. None of you, not a single person in our group today, thinks that sweeping immigration reform to provide a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented immigrants is going to happen. 56%, more than half, are optimistic that the more targeted approach that Biden was talking about last week will happen. A quarter of you think it's going to be mainly for show, and 19 of you say nothing's going to happen. And so, of course, we'll talk more about this in the weeks ahead. And next week, we'll have the topic, the discussion about critical race theory, which we'd originally scheduled today. But given such recent changes, both as it related to the January 6th investigation and as it relates to immigration policy, I hope you don't mind that we expand those two topics. And then we'll make critical race theory, which is an incredibly important topic as it relates to our nation's public schools and on many other fronts. We'll talk about that more next week. And we'll make that our featured topic that we start next week's conversation with. But before any of that, now we're going to switch from my monologue to my favorite part of the conversation, not just because Jessica joins us, but more importantly, because I get the chance to hear what's on all of your minds and to answer as many questions as I can with the half an hour that we have left before we wrap up today's program. So Jessica, what do we got?
Thank you so much, Dan. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to your talk on critical race theory next week. So sorry we didn't get to it today, but I hope we'll have more time next week to really dive into that. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for your continued support. We continue to depend on your donations to cover our expenses so that we can continue to bring you these important discussions. So if you are able, please consider making a donation by visiting our website, which is lawacth.org, and clicking on the donate button so we can continue these great talks with Dan and all of our other wonderful speakers. So thank you so much for your support. All right, now to the questions. U.S. Capitol Police are resisting reforms and are not being transparent in naming the police officer who shot a protester dead. Will Congress be able to demand reforms in a bipartisan way?
I have to admit, I agree with what our group said earlier more broadly about immigration policy. I think because Congress is not only so closely divided, but so polarized on this issue, even on something like this, which seems like a relatively common sense and necessary measure, I would be very surprised if Congress is able to act on it in a bipartisan manner. And boy, I hope I'm wrong. That said, this is the kind of issue that the Biden administration can act on unilaterally. Because if Biden issues an executive order, or if even the Attorney General or the head of Homeland Security decides this is something that needs to be addressed, that actually is something they can do unilaterally under certain circumstances. And because it doesn't benefit from the sort of lasting change that we were talking about a little bit earlier, the allure of doing it just out of the administration rather than with congressional approval and cooperation really is a viable option. So Congress should do it, but will they? I hope so, but think probably not.
Can the members of the Select Committee retain the services of researchers who are experts in fields that have relevance?
They certainly can. And one of the things that was most important, and unfortunately most overlooked about Pelosi's establishment of the Select Committee, is that it does have subpoena power. So not only will it have access to the types of researchers the questioner is asking about, but if someone is reluctant to cooperate with the committee, whether a researcher or a former president or someone in between, that additional legal clout is going to be of immense help to them in order to get the kind of information they need going forward with their investigation. So the answer is absolutely yes.
Is the H-2B foreign worker program still in effect, and are we allowing enough skilled workers into the country?
We are not allowing enough skilled workers into the country. And one of the cutbacks, and I'm going to talk about another legal immigration policy in just a minute, one of the most important policy changes of the Trump administration was in the area of legal immigration, where it dramatically cut back on the number of skilled foreign workers, and particularly the so-called H-1B visas, which disproportionately are responsible for allowing skilled technology workers to come to this country, is a program that suffered tremendously over the last 4 years. In fact, what Canada's done is they greatly expanded the number of tech workers who they allowed into their country. And what you now have is sort of a northern Silicon Valley in the Vancouver area, because so many smart tech experts have come from other parts of the world, not to the US, to lend their expertise and productivity to our country and our economy, but to Canada's instead. Biden has indicated that he wants to expand these programs. He is facing some institutional resistance from organized labor. And I have to admit at this point, I don't have a feel for how high a priority this is for Biden, whether it is something on which he's willing to take on some organized resistance. As if he decides it's a priority, then it's something he'll probably get. If he decides that it's not worth the fight, then it probably doesn't happen anytime soon. But the short answer to the question is we have a significant shortage of skilled workers in this country, not just in the technology field, but many others as well.
To what extent do you think Harris's delay in visiting the border will remain problematic for her?
Well, this is going to be a problem for Harris going forward. Not so much the border visit itself, but more broadly, it represents some difficulties that Harris has had in the first several months in which he has been in the office of vice president. Many of the nation's leading news publications, most notably the Politico website, has run stories about some discord and disorganization within the Harris operation. And to be fair to her, she's only been vice president for less than 6 months. And if she gets her shop in order, the kind of criticism she's taking now will be distant memories by 2024 or 2028. But as some who've observed Harris for many years during her time in the Senate, even as California's Attorney General, are concerned that some of the problems in the vice president's office are more endemic, and those could cause longer-term problems for her. So this is really on the vice president herself. If she can get things in order so these types of snafus don't take place in the future, like I said, there'll be distant memories before she faces the voters again. But if this does reflect some type of organizational challenge that she's not able or willing to fix, then it will be a bigger issue, either when she seeks re-election or at some point when she likely seeks the presidency.
Will unaccompanied minors be considered like the Dreamers sent to the US by their family?
Well, an unaccompanied minor who comes to the country presumably didn't make the decision to do so on their own. It's entirely reasonable to assume that a parent or other family member encouraged them to do so. Now, as those young people get into their teens, it's entirely possible that they made the decision on their own. But either way, my guess is, and it's just a guess, is that when it comes time to make a determination about whether a young person can remain in this country and ultimately whether they can achieve legal status or citizenship, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a much more forgiving approach for those under the age of 18 than for older people. I don't think an unaccompanied minor is going to get that fast track to citizenship that's beginning to look more likely for DACA recipients or Dreamers But I would be really surprised if going forward, an unaccompanied minor who came here was not given a less onerous path to stay under some type of legal status. But it's not a question this administration has addressed yet because they're so busy addressing the more urgent and almost emergency needs of so many of these young people. But once the dust settles, this is a really important question that's going to come up. And I do think we'll see a more flexible standard for young people than for those who've reached the age of adulthood.
Why don't we hire more judges for asylum cases on the Mexican border?
Well, this is a more complicated argument than it seems, because while I think there's fairly widespread agreement, at least among those who support immigration reform, that we do need more judges at the border, or that we do need a faster way of addressing these cases, either of economic migrants or of asylum seekers. Where the debate comes into play is whether it makes more sense to have more judges or whether it makes more sense to increase the number of caseworkers at the border and empower those caseworkers to make not permanent, but temporary decisions about whether an individual or family ought to be able to stay. A judge can make a more authoritative and a more long-lasting decision, but it takes more time. And given the numbers that we're still seeing in terms of border crossers, many in the Biden administration believe that giving caseworkers some of that authority, even on a temporary basis, can alleviate the short-term pressures, get an individual or family settled here even while they await hearings and move through the legal process. But ultimately, whether it's done by judges or by caseworkers, I'd say it's fairly safe to say that anyone who supports broader and somewhat more forgiving immigration reform does recognize the importance of a better staffed apparatus at and near the border. And even among those who support more stringent immigration policy, recognize there's a split in that cohort among those who don't want to see additional staff and resources deployed to the border. But there are a lot also who, even if they want more stringent border policy, recognize that our country does have to be in a position to process the individuals and families when they arrive. So it might be more judges. It's more likely, at least in the short term, to be more caseworkers. But either way, I think the questioner is about to see their concerns addressed in the very near future.
What do you expect the Biden administration to do about reforming legal immigration?
Well, this is a question we touched on a little bit earlier in today's conversation, particularly when it comes to questions regarding skilled workers. There is some division of thought within the Democratic Party, which makes the issue somewhat trickier for Biden. On a broader scale, Biden has made it very clear that he wants this country to be much more welcoming to legal migrants and wants the U.S. to increase the thresholds, the numbers of people who can come into this country legally. That's not going to happen today or tomorrow, and it might not happen for months or even for a couple years. But Biden has made it very clear that that's his long-term goal. The skilled workers question is going to be a battle going forward, but more broadly, long before the end of Biden's first term, I'd be very surprised if we did not see a very large increase in the number of legal immigrants permitted into the U.S.
Sorry about that. Do you think Democrats need to reconsider how they campaign, considering many illegal immigrants cited Biden's comments leading up to the election as their reason for heading to the U.S.?
Well, this is an immense challenge for Biden, and it's one that's reflected in the poll numbers that I cited earlier. When Democratic voters who give Biden 90% or plus favorable ratings on almost every other issue on which they were asked, but only about 60% on immigration, that means that there's a real problem even within Biden's own ranks. And it's an even greater challenge for Biden and other Democrats as it relates to independent voters. Now, most independents do support a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. But most independent voters also support a more enhanced presence at the US-Mexico border. And the difficult path for Biden to walk is, on one hand, to reach out to the more centrist Democrats and independents. That requires talking not just about legalization, but about border security. But those are the kind of conversations that really alarm the progressive base of his party. And so he's going to hear from the left in a very strong way about any move he makes to increase border security. As I mentioned earlier, he's going to hear from the base of the party a lot, even if and unhappily, even if he decides to pursue a more limited pathway to citizenship for the groups we talked about earlier, rather than for the full number of undocumented immigrants currently living in the country. It's an issue that greatly divides the Democratic Party, and it might be Biden's greatest domestic political challenge, not only for the midterms, but for the presidential campaign in 2024.
How will the Biden administration handle permitting international students into the US?
It's pretty clear that the Biden administration wants to restore the guidelines and opportunities that were available to international students prior to 2017. And it is going to take some time to get that apparatus back in place. There's no shortage of students from other parts of the world who would like to come back to US colleges and universities this fall, but logistically that might not yet be possible. But Biden has emphasized throughout his campaign in the first months of his administration that bringing these young people into the country to study is not only a good thing for them, but it's a good thing for us. Years ago, us, the United States, years ago, Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, wrote a famous piece in which he suggested that a green card be stapled to every diploma that every international student received at a US college and university in order to encourage them to stay here and become productive members of our country's workforce rather than remaining home. That's going to be more difficult for Biden and his successors to accomplish, because for any number of reasons, a much larger number of these young people are going to want to return to their birth countries upon achieving their degrees. The other real challenge in the short term, which I think will be solved eventually, but is going to be difficult to create a real obstacle for the next few years, is along with those young people who want to come and study in this country next year and might not yet be able to, there's also a lot of young people around the world who over the last years have changed their mind about whether they want to come to the US to study or not, and whether it's as alluring a possibility as it might have been for their older brothers and sisters. So Biden, no doubt, wants to at least restore, if not expand, opportunities for international students at US colleges and universities. But as I've just tried to indicate, there's a number of potholes along the way which are going to allow him to accomplish that goal, but make it more difficult than it almost certainly needs to be.
Do you have any concerns that subpoenas issued by Pelosi or her committee will be any more successful, considering that if ignored, they will still have to be enforced by the courts?
Well, I think there's a real concern about whether former President Trump would respond to a subpoena or not. But beyond Trump and his most loyal supporters, a congressional committee with subpoena power is a pretty big deal. And I would assume that not all, but most members of his administration would respond to that subpoena if issued. Some would not, and those, as the questioner correctly pointed out, would have to be resolved in the courts over a considerable period of time. But even if Trump and his cabinet members did not respond to subpoenas and those did have to be fought out in the courts, the non-political appointees at the Justice Department, at the Department of Defense, and of course, individuals working on the Capitol Police or the DC Police would all, I think, would be very, very likely to respond to subpoenas. So while it might be more difficult to get some of the higher-ranking administration officials to agree to appear without that prolonged court fight, which I think is likely to force it. I think enough other people who are instrumental to the events of, who are very involved in the events of January 6th and the days leading up to it would not only be very responsive to subpoenas, but would give Congress and ultimately the rest of us a lot more information about the events of that day than we currently have. So Trump might not, his top appointees may or may not, but the overwhelming majority of people who would have valuable information that we'd benefit from learning, I think they would be very responsive to a congressional subpoena.
Is a select committee being set up to look into all the riots throughout the USA last year? And are the looters being brought to justice? Or is the select committee selecting which riots are more important?
Well, this is the argument that Republicans had made against both the original idea of a bipartisan commission and this current select committee. They believe that the real scope of this type of panel, whether a commission or committee or any other, ought not just to limit itself to the events of January 6th, but look at any number of acts of violence that occurred around the country last summer and fall, including at any number of federal government facilities around the country. It appears that neither Pelosi nor Benny Thompson is interested in that broader approach. If it were left for me, and I know all of you know by now that I don't really like to take sides in these things, but if you'll excuse an exception in order for me to make what I think is a fairly reasonable middle ground suggestion, I do understand why Pelosi wants to limit this investigation just to the events of January 6th, because an attack on the US Capitol really is a unique event. But it seems to me, in a less partisan, less polarized world, that Congress would also, perhaps as part of a separate investigation, also look into the other instances of violence that the questioner referred to. It doesn't have to be either or. The only reason it is because the two parties are at such loggerheads. I think there's no reason we shouldn't be able to look at the events of January 6th in one investigation because of the unique nature of those events. But I think there is some considerable benefit in a separate parallel or follow-up investigation that took the sort of broader approach that the questioner suggested. So, in my opinion, at least, it's a reasonable proposal. In my estimation, it's unlikely to occur, at least not until Republicans achieve control of one chamber or other of Congress, either in 2022 or 2024 or beyond. And at that point, I think you would see just the kind of special committee that the questioner raised.
6 months on, prosecutions for participation in the January 6th event seem to be moving very slowly. Why?
Well, the main reason things are moving so slowly is because the partisanship and polarization is so bitter. The Democrats proposed a bipartisan task force. The Republicans said no. The Democrats set up a special committee. The Republicans are still deciding whether or not to participate or not. And so while on one hand, the Republicans are being resistant for the reasons I mentioned earlier, it doesn't do them any good in the midterm elections to have an ongoing, very visible discussion about what Donald Trump did and did not do on January 6th. But as I said a moment ago in answer to the previous question, while the Republicans are being, in my opinion, unnecessarily resistant, I feel like the Democrats are being not nearly as compromising as they could be. And by compromising, I don't mean compromising the integrity and the scope of a January 6th investigation, but by looking more broadly under a separate purview as to other types of violence that didn't raise to the level of the events of January 6th. It's worth noting that in addition to I guess 2 points I'd make real quick before we go on, Jessica. One, to be fair, it took Congress more than a year after the events of September 11th to set up the 9/11 Bipartisan Commission. So by comparison, it's not moving that slowly, and sometimes that's just the way Congress works, regardless of the circumstances. But the other thing that's important to keep in mind is in addition to the fairly slow progress of the establishment of the committee, on the ground at the Capitol, efforts to increase and enhance capital security have barely progressed at all. And that's a matter of great concern for anyone who cares about allowing the U.S. capital to remain accessible to the American public as a symbol of our democracy. The staffing there, the logistics of improving security, none of that has happened yet. And in some ways, that should be of even greater concern than the pace with which the committee is moving forward.
Is it too early to be concerned about the midterm elections? When will races begin picking up? And what are the major things you are looking for at this point?
Well, it's not too early to be thinking about the midterm elections, if only because both parties are already thinking about them. And both parties have been thinking about the midterm elections since last November, if not before. And today we talked about two really important issues, the January 6th Commission and immigration policy. These are two of any number of issues that are going to have an immense impact on the outcome of next year's midterms. And I always try, and we'll do this as we continue our programming all the way through the midterms, hopefully, I will constantly remind you that there is a distinction between political motivations for legislative and policy activity versus policy ramifications of policy and legislative action. So in other words, it's one thing to pass a bill because it's going to help your party in the midterm elections. It's one thing to vote for or against a bill solely because of its impact on a candidate's reelection or on who controls either or both houses of Congress. And that's politics at its least attractive. But even if every single member of Congress of both parties, of both the House and the Senate, avoided all political motivations in casting votes on these important issues, which is impossible, but just to make the point, even if every single member of Congress was able to avoid political motivations for their legislative activity, there's still political ramifications. And so if the Biden administration does implement executive orders changing border policy, whether or not you happen to think that's motivated by midterm reelection concerns, there's no question it's going to have a huge impact on both campaigns. If Republicans vote for or against particular types of immigration reform, whether you happen to think they're doing that for political reasons or policy reasons or some combination of both, regardless, it does have an immense political impact on next year's races. So every action that Congress takes, every action that the administration takes, does have political ramifications, whether they're politically motivated or not. And so we won't talk about public policy over the next 16, 17 months only in the context of the midterm elections, I promise you. It'd be foolish not to acknowledge that each of these policy debates does have an important role in how these elections are resolved. So no, I don't think it's too easy to be thinking in that context at all.
What is the status of separated families' children? Have they been united with parents or placed with foster entities here?
This is a work in progress. Large numbers of children have been reunited with either their parents or family members in the country, but hundreds still have not. And the administration is, from what I read, working very hard to try to find a way to reunite these children with, if not parents, with family members. The challenge they face is particularly younger children often don't have the capacity to explain where that parent or where that family member is and how to find them. And so while it does appear that the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security are devoting very large numbers of staff time and effort to reunifying, sadly, there's still hundreds of children who haven't been either returned to their parents or given to a family member or other appropriate guardian. There's complications on this also, particularly when we're talking about guardians who aren't the child's parent, and how quickly you should turn that child over to an adult guardian who doesn't have that parental relationship. But that's going to have to be a longer conversation for another day, isn't it, Jessica?
Yes, I think it will be. Well, Dan, thank you so much. And to our audience, I know some of you sent in some questions about critical race theory, so I have saved those. So we will get to those next week as well when we resume that topic.
And that'll be our first topic next week.
Awesome. Oh, great. Well, to our audience, thank you for all of your great questions. And Dan, thanks again for another interesting and insightful hour.
Thank you, Jessica. As always, we really appreciate all your great work.
Jessica, thank you so much for handling all those questions so very well. Dan, what a terrific discussion today. Thank you so much.
Well,
Great
thank you.
to bring us back from 4th of July.
Well, I really enjoyed it as always, and I hope that the group did too.
For those of you who enjoy more of Dan, every other week on Tuesdays, immediately following his program, we have a special members only discussion with Dan, which is today going to start in just a few minutes. So if you're not a member and you would enjoy more time one-on-one with Dan, please sign up, become a member today. I just wanted to highlight a couple of quickly update you on upcoming programs so that we can go to our after this webinar program with Dan in just a few minutes. Of course, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus every Tuesday at 11 o'clock. On July 8th, Preserving Los Angeles, How Historic Places Can Transform America's Cities. We also have several member-only events coming up. We have on the 16th, a member screening, Enemies of the State. On the 28th, a member-led discussion on how global cities are confronting homelessness. And again, a member screening, The Lost Leonardo, on July 30th. Thank you all for joining us today. Please check out our website for upcoming programs, and we hope to see you this week for our other programs. See you in a few minutes, Dan. Thank you,
everybody.